A millionaire disguised himself as a beggar to test his own company and discovered something shocking. What he saw that day revealed who truly had character when no one was watching. Amidst contempt and indifference, only one employee did something that changed everything inside. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. Monday morning arrived just like any other in Chicago. The sky, heavy with low clouds, announced another typical day in the city, where millions of people woke up early to face chaotic traffic and the responsibilities that awaited them. In the Gold Coast neighborhood, in a spacious and luxurious apartment on the 12th floor of a modern building, Arthur Sterling watched the intense movement on Lakeshore Drive through the window while sipping his espresso. At 48 years old, he had built an empire in the technology and business consulting sector. Sterling & Associates was synonymous with success, innovation, and results that impressed even the most experienced competitors. Arthur had always been a man of vision. The son of a small shopkeeper from rural Nebraska, he arrived in Chicago young, with little money in his pocket and great determination in his heart. He studied at night, worked during the day, saved every penny, and invested in knowledge. When he finally managed to open his own company 20 years ago, he made a point of creating a different environment. He wanted every employee to feel valued, respected, and part of something bigger. In the early years, he knew everyone by name, participated in birthdays, and listened to each person's difficulties. But growth came quickly. Important contracts, expansion to other cities, new offices, hundreds of employees. What was once a team of 15 people now consisted of more than 300 collaborators spread across 3 floors of a corporate building in the West Loop. The numbers were impressive. Profits grew quarter after quarter. The company's reputation in the market was solid. Arthur should have been satisfied, fulfilled, and proud of everything he had achieved. But something had changed. He felt it. It wasn't something that could be measured in spreadsheets or graphs. It was an uncomfortable, silent sensation that grew every time he visited the offices. Conversations in the hallways seemed forced, mechanical. The smiles were too professional, too polite, too empty. No one seemed truly happy. Everyone was busy, hurried, focused on goals and deadlines. Humanity had given way to efficiency. In recent months, this restlessness only increased. Arthur began to notice small signs. A secretary crying secretly in the bathroom. An intern being harshly reprimanded for an insignificant mistake. Malicious comments about colleagues who weren't present. Mocking laughter when someone made a slip-up. Everything was disguised as professionalism, but loaded with coldness and disrespect. He tried to talk to Penelope, his wife of 22 years. Sitting at the dinner table that Sunday night, Arthur vented his concerns. Penelope, always practical and direct, responded that he was exaggerating. She said that large companies naturally become more impersonal, that it's impossible to maintain a family atmosphere when you have 300 employees. She reminded him that the results were excellent, that the company was doing well, and that he should concentrate on that. Arthur didn't argue, but he wasn't convinced either. Penelope never fully understood his relationship with the company. To her, business was business. Profit was profit. Feelings had no place in the corporate world. Perhaps that was why their marriage had also become so distant in recent years. They shared the same bed, the same house, the same routine, but it had been a long time since they shared dreams, fears, or real conversations. Their eldest son, Robert, 24 years old, had been working at the company for 2 years. A business administration graduate, he held a coordination position in the finance sector. Arthur hoped that Robert would one day take over the leadership of Sterling & Associates, but he noticed that his son treated work with a worrying coldness. To Robert, everything was numbers, strategy, and competition. He talked about cutting costs, reducing benefits, and increasing pressure on teams. Arthur recognized in those words the same mentality that was destroying the company's environment. Their youngest daughter, Julia, 19 years old, was studying psychology at Northwestern University. She was different, sensitive, inquisitive, always concerned about the people around her. Once, during a family lunch, Julia asked her father if he really knew the people who worked for him, if he knew the names, the stories, and the dreams of each employee. Arthur remained silent. The question hurt because it touched on something he had already been feeling: the distance between him and those who made the company function every day. It was precisely this question that planted the seed of the idea. For weeks, Arthur thought about how he could discover the truth about the work environment his company had become. He could hire an external consultancy to conduct an organizational climate survey, but he knew the answers would be filtered, politically correct, and useless. He could talk directly to the employees, but as the owner of the company, his presence would always be intimidating and would always generate rehearsed answers. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, while driving along the Kennedy Expressway returning from a meeting, Arthur saw a man sitting under an overpass, wrapped in old blankets, holding out his hand to passing cars. The scene was common in Chicago, but at that moment it provoked something different in Arthur. He thought about how that man was invisible to most people, how everyone passed him without really seeing him, without considering that there was a human being with a history, feelings, and dignity. And that's when the idea was born. Radical, risky, almost absurd, but also deeply revealing. Arthur decided he would test his own company. He would enter the Sterling & Associates building disguised as a homeless man, someone who appears to have no value in the eyes of society. He wanted to see how he would be treated when no one knew who he really was. He wanted to find out if humanity still existed in that corporate environment, or if everything had been transformed into numbers, goals, and appearances. In the following days, Arthur began to plan. He set aside old clothes he kept in the back of the closet, those he used when he went fishing or did manual labor at his cabin. He decided he would let his beard grow for a week, dishevel his hair, and dirty his face a bit. Nothing too exaggerated, just enough to look like someone living on the streets, someone society usually ignores. Penelope thought the idea was ridiculous when he told her. She said it was a waste of time, that he had more important things to do. Robert laughed, saying his father was becoming too sentimental and should worry about the quarterly numbers. Only Julia supported him. She looked into her father's eyes and said it was courageous, that it showed he still cared about people. Those words were the final push Arthur needed. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week later, Arthur woke up earlier than usual. Penelope was still sleeping when he got out of bed and went to the bathroom. He observed his reflection in the mirror. The stubble was already beginning to change his appearance. His eyes were tired, with dark circles marked by the anxiety of the last few nights. He looked like a different man. He put on a pair of faded jeans torn at the knee, an old and stained t-shirt, and a worn-out coat that had seen better days. He put on a pair of scuffed sneakers with soles that were nearly coming off. He messed up his hair and rubbed some dirt on his face and hands. He looked in the mirror again and almost didn't recognize himself. He took his car and drove to the West Loop. He parked 3 blocks away from the company building on a side street where no one would recognize him. He walked slowly toward the building that boasted the name Sterling & Associates in huge letters on the facade. His heart beat fast. It wasn't fear, it was expectation. The expectation of discovering the truth he suspected but hoped was wrong. When he arrived in front of the building, Arthur took a deep breath. There the test began. There he would discover if the company he built with so much sweat still had a soul, or if it had become just another cold machine for producing profit. He didn't know yet that what he was about to discover would change not only the company but also his own life, the way he saw the world and the people around him. Arthur pushed the glass revolving door and entered. The security guard at the front desk looked at him with immediate suspicion. The test had begun. The guard at the desk stood up immediately when he saw Arthur enter. It was Samuel, a man in his 50s who had worked at the company for at least 10 years. Arthur recognized him instantly, but Samuel had no idea who was standing before him. The guard's eyes scanned Arthur from head to toe, evaluating every detail of the ragged clothes, the disheveled hair, and the unshaven face. "You can't stay here, sir," Samuel said in a firm, almost harsh voice. "This is a commercial building. It's not a place to ask for handouts." Arthur felt the first impact of those words. He had imagined he would be treated coldly, but hearing that from someone he greeted every day, someone who received a salary from him, someone who should represent the company with dignity, hurt in a way he didn't expect. He took a deep breath and kept his posture hunched, his head slightly lowered, as he imagined someone in a street situation would. "I just wanted to talk to someone," Arthur said, forcing his voice to sound weaker and more tired. I'm looking for work, anything. I just need an opportunity." Samuel let out an impatient sigh and pointed to the door. "There are no openings for you here, my friend. And even if there were, we don't hire like this at the front door. There's a selection process, resumes, things like that. You need to leave before I have to call someone," Arthur insisted. "I just wanted to talk to someone from Human Resources, maybe someone who could listen." Samuel shook his head negatively and took a step forward, closing the space between them. His tone became even harder. "Look, I already told you that you can't stay. If you don't leave nicely, I'll have to escort you out. I don't want trouble here." At that moment, 2 female administrative employees passed through the revolving door, chatting excitedly about some weekend event. When they saw the scene, they stopped for a moment. One was Ashley, a marketing assistant Arthur had seen a few times in meetings. The other was Brianna, new to the company, hired just a few months ago. The two exchanged quick looks, loaded with discomfort and disapproval. "What a situation," Ashley commented in a low voice but loud enough for Arthur to hear. "They're showing up earlier and earlier. Soon they'll be asking inside the offices." Brianna gave a short laugh and replied as they walked toward the elevators. "Yeah, I think security here is too lax. Anyone can just walk in." Arthur felt the weight of those words. Anyone. As if he were nobody. As if his presence were an annoyance, a problem that needed to be solved quickly. He wanted to scream, to reveal who he was, to make them understand the absurdity of it all. But he knew he had to continue. He needed to see how far that coldness went. Samuel noticed that Arthur hadn't moved and insisted again. "Come on, friend. Don't make me be harder on you. You seem like a calm guy, so let's make things easy. Get out of here and go look for help somewhere else. There's a social assistance center near the subway station. They can help you better than we can." Arthur finally stepped back a few paces, but he didn't leave completely. He stayed near the entrance, observing the movement. Employees entered and left constantly. Some carried leather briefcases. Others spoke on cell phones with serious expressions, discussing contracts and deadlines. No one looked at him. It was as if Arthur were invisible, an unimportant shadow that didn't deserve even a second of attention. A man in an impeccable suit, whom Arthur recognized as Gregory, the commercial manager, passed right next to him. Arthur tried to make eye contact, but Gregory quickly looked away and quickened his pace. The message was clear. People like that didn't even deserve a glance. Samuel continued watching Arthur from a distance, ready to intervene if he tried to enter again. Arthur decided to try a different approach. He walked to one of the benches near the entrance, outside the building, and sat down. From that point, he could still observe who was coming and going. He could see the reactions, the gestures, the expressions. It didn't take long for a group of interns to arrive, talking loudly and laughing. They were young, probably in their early 20s, full of energy and expectations. When they passed Arthur, one of them commented jokingly, "Look at the resident at the entrance. He must be waiting for the meal vouchers." The others laughed. Arthur felt the humiliation burn inside him. Those young people who had barely started their careers already treated human beings with such contempt. Where did they learn that? From whom? Perhaps from the managers themselves, from the company culture that he himself had allowed to develop. For nearly an hour, Arthur remained sitting on that bench. He watched dozens of employees pass by. Some looked briefly and quickly turned away. Others simply ignored him as if he didn't exist. There were those who made faces of disgust, those who purposely moved away as they passed. No one asked if he needed anything. No one offered help. No one showed the slightest empathy. At one point, Robert, his own son, left the building accompanied by 2 colleagues from the finance sector. They were discussing numbers, talking about budget cuts and expense reductions. Arthur tensed up. Would Robert recognize him? Would his son have a different reaction? Robert walked straight past. He didn't even look. He continued talking to his colleagues, laughing at some internal joke, completely oblivious to the presence of his father sitting there, disguised and invisible. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. If his own son couldn't see him, how could he expect strangers to? The morning progressed and Arthur decided to try to enter again. Samuel had gone to lunch, and another, younger guard had taken over the post. Arthur took advantage of the shift change and entered through the lobby. He walked toward the elevators, trying to look determined, as if he had a specific destination. But before he could press the button, a voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir, do you have authorization to go up?" It was Mitchell, the security supervisor, a tall and serious man whom Arthur knew well. Again, no sign of recognition. Arthur stammered something about wanting to speak with someone from the Human Resources Department. Mitchell was direct. "If you don't have an appointment, you don't go up. It's company policy. You need to leave." Arthur tried to argue, saying he only needed a few minutes, that he was willing to do any work, that he was a hard worker, honest. Mitchell remained inflexible. "Sorry, but I can't help. You need to leave. Now." Other people began to gather near the elevators, waiting. Some cast curious glances at the scene. Arthur noticed whispers, discreet comments. He felt exposed, humiliated, reduced to nothing. Was this what people on the streets felt every day? This constant sensation of being a problem, an annoyance, something that needs to be pushed away. As Mitchell escorted him to the exit, Arthur saw Penelope. His wife was entering the building, probably coming to have lunch with Robert, as she usually did on Fridays. She carried a designer bag, wore an elegant dress and high heels. She looked beautiful, impeccable, exactly as she always was. When her eyes crossed Arthur's for a fraction of a second, he thought she might recognize him. But Penelope just quickly looked away with an expression of slight discomfort and continued walking. There was no recognition, there was no empathy, only polite indifference. Arthur felt a deep pain. 22 years of marriage and his own wife didn't recognize him. Or worse, she didn't want to recognize him. She didn't want to see someone who appeared to have no value. Mitchell led him firmly to the sidewalk. "Look, I understand you need work, but this isn't the place. Try somewhere else, okay? And don't come back, or I'll have to take more serious measures." Arthur nodded and walked away. He walked to the corner and stopped under an awning. He was tired, emotionally exhausted. In just a few hours of experience, he had felt firsthand what thousands of people face daily. Invisibility, contempt, coldness, the absolute lack of empathy. But he wouldn't give up. There was still more to discover. He still needed to see if there was any spark of humanity in that company, if someone would be capable of seeing beyond appearances. He took a deep breath, wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn coat, and decided to try one more time. This time, he would enter through the service entrance where cleaning and maintenance staff usually circulated. Perhaps there, away from the corporate spotlight, he would find something different. Perhaps there he would discover that hope still existed. Arthur didn't know it, but he was about to find exactly what he was looking for in the person he least expected. The service entrance was at the back of the building, in a less busy area where delivery trucks parked and maintenance workers moved around without the formality of the main lobby. Arthur walked there with tired steps, feeling the emotional weight of everything he had experienced in the last few hours. Every look of contempt, every gesture of indifference, every cold word had left a deep mark on his heart. The service door was slightly ajar. Arthur entered quietly and found himself in a narrow hallway with grey-painted walls and flickering fluorescent lighting. The smell of cleaning products was strong. In the background, he could hear the noise of washing machines and the muffled sound of conversations. He walked down the hallway, not knowing exactly what he was looking for. He just wanted to stay there for a few minutes to observe if people acted differently in this less corporate environment. He passed a room where some maintenance workers were having a coffee break. They looked at him with curiosity, but no one said anything. Arthur moved on. It was when he turned a corner that he found her. A woman of approximately 55 years was kneeling on the floor, cleaning the baseboard of a wall with a damp cloth. She wore a navy blue uniform, her grey hair was tied in a simple bun, and her hands were marked by years of hard work. When she noticed Arthur's presence, she looked up and their eyes met. There was no contempt, there was no fear, there was no indifference, there was only a human look, genuine and full of life. "Good afternoon," she said in a soft voice, smiling. "Can I help you with anything?" Arthur froze for a moment. After hours of being treated like trash, someone had finally greeted him with respect. Someone had looked at him as a human being. He felt his eyes sting, but he controlled the emotion. I was just looking for a little water," Arthur said, keeping his voice weak. "I'm thirsty." The woman didn't hesitate. She stood up immediately, put the cloth in the bucket and gestured for him to follow her. "Come with me. There's a water fountain right nearby." She led him to a small employee break room. It was a simple space with a laminate table, some plastic chairs, an old microwave, and a bottled water cooler. She took a disposable cup, filled it with fresh water, and handed it to Arthur carefully, as if she were offering something precious. "Here you go, dear, drink slowly." Arthur held the cup with both hands and drank. The water was cold and refreshing. But what really touched him wasn't the water, it was the gesture, it was the kindness. It was the fact that this woman didn't judge him by his appearance, didn't treat him as a problem, and didn't want to get rid of him quickly. When he finished drinking, she took the empty cup and asked, "Would you like more?" Arthur shook his head. "Thank you, Ma'am, you are very kind." She shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Don't mention it. It's the least one can do, right? Everyone needs help every now and then." Arthur sat in one of the chairs and she did the same, pulling another chair for herself. She seemed genuinely interested in talking, without haste or judgment. "How did you end up here?" she asked gently. Arthur improvised a story. He said he was looking for work, that he had gone through difficulties recently, and that he just needed an opportunity. The woman listened attentively, nodding, her eyes conveying true understanding. "I understand," she said when Arthur finished. "Life isn't easy for anyone, is it? But we can't give up. While there is life, there is hope. You seem like a hard-working man. I'm sure you'll find something." Arthur asked her name. "Lorraine," she answered with a smile. "Mrs. Lorraine to most, but you can just call me Lorraine. I've worked here for 15 years. I started right after my husband passed away. I needed to support my 3 children on my own." Arthur felt a pang in his chest. 15 years working at his company, and he didn't even know who she was. How many times had he passed her in the hallways without really seeing her? How many times had he treated her as an invisible part of the furniture? "And do you like working here?" Arthur asked. Lorraine thought for a moment before answering. "Look, it's not a dream job, is it? But it pays my bills, it gives me dignity, and I do my work with pride. It might not seem like much to many people, but I know I'm contributing. I keep everything clean and organized. Sometimes the employees don't even notice, but I know I make a difference." She paused and continued in a more thoughtful tone. "What makes me sad sometimes is how people treat us. Not everyone, but many. There are people who don't even look at our faces. There are people who treat us as if we were less important just because we clean floors. But I learned one thing from my mother. Every honest job has value, and every person, no matter what they do or where they are, deserves respect." Arthur felt every one of those words like a stab. She was describing exactly the environment he had allowed to be created, a place where a person's value was measured by their title, their salary, or their appearance. "You're right," Arthur said with a choked voice. "People forget that we are all equal, that we all deserve dignity." Lorraine smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder in a motherly gesture. "That's it. We pass through this life so fast, you know. It's not worth wasting time being mean to others. I prefer to be kind. I prefer to help when I can. Because in the end, that's what remains. It's not the money, it's not the title, it's how we treated people." At that moment, a young man entered the break room. He must have been 27 or 28. He wore a dress shirt and jeans and carried a backpack. When he saw Arthur, he stopped for a moment, evaluating the situation. Lorraine quickly explained. "He needed some water, David. I brought him here." David nodded and walked to the water cooler. He poured himself some water and then, instead of leaving immediately, pulled up a chair and sat with them. "Are you looking for work?" he asked Arthur with genuine interest. Arthur confirmed he was. David took a sip of water and said, "I know how it is. I've been through that too. About 5 years ago, I was unemployed with no prospects, almost living on the street. It was so hard. People look at you differently when you have nothing, as if you're worth nothing." He paused and continued. "But I was lucky. Someone gave me a chance, helped me get an internship here. It was the beginning. Today I'm an IT assistant. It's not much yet, but I'm growing. And that's why I always try to help those going through what I went through." David took his wallet from his pocket and offered some bills to Arthur. "Take this. It's not much, but it'll buy a meal, maybe a shower at a shelter." Arthur felt tears threatening to overflow. He gently refused the money but thanked him deeply. "You and this lady are special people," he said with a trembling voice. "You have no idea how much this means." Lorraine and David exchanged glances and smiled. "We do what we can," Lorraine said. "If everyone did a little bit, the world would be much better, don't you think?" The three talked for a few more minutes. Lorraine told stories of her children, how she managed to pay for the older two's college by working hard. David shared his plans to go to grad school, to grow in the company, and to one day be able to help others the way he was helped. Arthur listened to them attentively, absorbing every word, every gesture, every demonstration of genuine kindness. In that small space, away from the luxurious offices and meeting rooms, he had found more humanity than in the rest of the building combined. When he finally stood up to leave, Lorraine also stood up and gave him a sincere hug. "Everything will work out, you'll see. Have faith, and if you need anything, come back here. We'll help however we can." David shook his hand firmly. "Stay strong, life gets better, I'm proof of that." Arthur left that break room transformed. Now he knew exactly what he needed to do. He was certain that values still existed, but they were in the right people, in the right places. And he was certain he needed to change everything. Radically, completely, starting from the top. Tomorrow, Monday, he would return, but this time as himself, and everyone would discover what really happened that day. Everyone would know who showed character and who revealed coldness, and nothing would ever be the same. The weekend passed slowly for Arthur. Saturday and Sunday were days of deep reflection. He could barely sleep, reliving every moment of that transformative Friday. Every look of contempt, every cold word, every gesture of indifference continued to echo in his mind. But the words of Mrs. Lorraine also echoed, as did David's genuine smile and the kindness he found exactly where he least expected it. Penelope asked several times what was happening to him. She noticed the silence, the distant look, the tension he carried in his shoulders. Arthur only replied that he was rethinking some things about the company. She didn't insist. In recent years, they had become accustomed to not sharing much beyond the formalities of daily life. Robert spent Sundays studying financial reports, preparing a presentation on cost-cutting. Julia, on the other hand, sat with her father on Sunday night and asked if he had discovered anything important. Arthur looked into his daughter's eyes and said only yes, that he had discovered much more than he imagined. She smiled and held his hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not everyone has the courage to do what you did." Monday dawned with a clear sky in Chicago. Arthur woke up early, showered, shaved carefully, and dressed in one of his best suits. He looked in the mirror and saw the successful businessman again, the respected man, the owner of Sterling and Associates. But now that reflection had a different meaning. Now he knew that the external image guaranteed nothing about character, values, or humanity. He arrived at the office before 8 in the morning. Samuel was at the front desk, as always. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," the guard said with a polite smile, opening the door promptly. Arthur returned the greeting but observed him closely. It was the same Samuel who on Friday had treated a man appearing to be a beggar with harshness and impatience. The difference was absurd. The treatment changed completely depending on clothes, appearance, and status. Arthur went straight to his office on the 11th floor. He sat in his leather chair, looked through the wide window overlooking the busy city, and picked up the phone. He called Sarah, his executive secretary. "Sarah, I want you to call a general meeting for 10 o'clock this morning, all employees, no exceptions." Sarah seemed surprised. "Everyone, Mr. Sterling, including cleaning, maintenance, security staff." "Everyone," Arthur repeated firmly, "especially them." The news of the general meeting spread quickly. It was unusual. Arthur rarely called meetings with all employees. He usually communicated only with top managers. Speculation began to circulate in the hallways. Some thought it would be a bonus announcement. Others feared mass layoffs. No one imagined what was truly coming. At 10 o'clock sharp, the company auditorium was packed. 300 employees occupied the seats, talking in low voices, curious and apprehensive. In the front row were the main directors and managers. Robert was there, next to Gregory, the commercial manager. Penelope had also been invited and sat discreetly in the corner. In the back rows was Mrs. Lorraine, wearing her navy blue uniform, her hands clasped in her lap, curious about the reason for this unusual summons. David was a few rows ahead, next to other IT employees. Samuel and Mitchell, the security guards, stood at the back of the auditorium. Arthur entered through the side door and walked onto the stage. Silence fell immediately over the room. All eyes turned to him. Arthur positioned himself behind the lectern, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's unusual to call a meeting like this with all sectors, but what I need to share today concerns every person who works in this company." He paused, looking closely at the audience. "It has been 20 years since I founded Sterling & Associates. I started small, with great determination and a dream. I wanted to build not just a financially successful company, but a place where people felt valued, respected, and part of something bigger. In the early years, I believe I achieved that. But with growth, I realized something changed, and that change deeply bothered me." Some people in the audience began to exchange glances. Where was this going? Arthur continued. "In recent months, I've been observing worrying signs: coldness in the hallways, lack of empathy, people being treated as numbers, as replaceable parts, malicious comments, mocking laughter, an environment where respect seems to depend on the position you hold or the clothes you wear." He could see the discomfort beginning to spread through the room. Some people shifted restlessly in their seats. I could have hired a consultancy to conduct an organizational climate survey. I could have asked for reports, graphs, analyses, but I knew that wouldn't reveal the truth. The answers would be filtered and politically correct. So I decided to do something different, something that would show me, without masks, who the people working here really are. Arthur paused again, letting the tension build. "Last Friday I was here, but not as you know me. I dressed as a beggar, old clothes, a disheveled appearance, unshaven. And I entered this building pretending to be someone who needs help, someone looking for a job opportunity." A shocked murmur ran through the auditorium. People turned to one another, incredulous. Robert turned pale. Penelope put her hand to her mouth. Samuel, at the back of the room, widened his eyes. Arthur continued, his voice firm but loaded with emotion. "And what I discovered was revealing. I discovered that when you believe you are dealing with someone of no value, many of you show who you really are. I was treated with contempt. I was kicked out of the entrance. I heard offensive comments. I was ignored as if I were invisible. I spent hours sitting in front of this building, and dozens of employees passed me without offering even a glance of empathy." Tears began to run down the faces of some people. Others lowered their heads in shame. Arthur saw Ashley and Brianna, the two who made malicious comments, covering their faces with their hands. "I saw my own son walk past me without even looking," Arthur continued, looking directly at Robert. "I saw my wife look away, uncomfortable with my presence. I saw managers, coordinators, people in leadership positions treat me like trash that needs to be thrown away." The room was in absolute silence now. Only the sound of discreet sobbing broke the stillness. "But," Arthur continued, and his voice took on a softer tone, "I also discovered that goodness still exists in this company. I found people who showed true humanity, people who didn't judge me by my appearance, people who offered help without expecting anything in return." He pointed to the back of the room. "Mrs. Lorraine, could you please come up here?" Lorraine was confused and startled. She looked around, not understanding. David, beside her, encouraged her with a nod. She stood up timidly and walked to the front. Arthur stepped down from the stage and went to meet her. "This woman," Arthur said with a choked voice, "has worked here for 15 years. 15 years cleaning our offices, taking care of the environment where we work. And I ashamed to admit, had never really talked to her. I had never looked into her eyes and recognized her value." Lorraine's eyes were watery, still not fully understanding. "On Friday, when everyone ignored me, when everyone treated me like a problem, she was the one who stopped. She was the one who offered water. She was the one who talked to me with respect and dignity, without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return, just out of pure kindness." Arthur held Lorraine's hands. "From today on, you are no longer a cleaning employee. You are our coordinator of human relations, with a significant salary increase and the mission to help rebuild the values of this company." Lorraine began to cry. Arthur hugged her while the audience, little by little, began to applaud. Some applause was genuine, some ashamed, but all recognized the justice of that moment. David was also called forward. Arthur told how the young man offered money, shared his own story of hardship, and showed true empathy. David also received a promotion and recognition. Arthur returned to the lectern and concluded, "This company is going to change. It's not enough to have profit if we lose our humanity in the process. From today on, we will implement training programs focused on empathy, respect, and dignity. There will be no dismissals because of what happened on Friday, but there will be consequences. And there will be, above all, transformation." He looked at everyone one by one. "I want each of you to reflect on who you were on Friday, and I want you to decide who you want to be from now on. Because a person's true character is revealed when they think no one important is watching." The meeting ended in a heavy silence. People left slowly, many with tears in their eyes, others with shame written on their faces. Arthur knew he had planted a seed. Now he needed to care for it so it would grow and truly transform that place. The silence that took over the auditorium after Arthur's speech was dense, loaded with contradictory emotions. Shame, regret, disbelief, admiration. Everything mixed in a whirlwind of feelings that each employee processed in their own way. Gradually, people began to stand and leave, many with red eyes, others with their heads down, unable to look at their colleagues. Arthur remained on stage, watching. He saw Ashley and Brianna leave quickly without looking back, their hands partially covering their faces. He saw Samuel standing at the back of the room, his shoulders slumped, the expression of someone who had just understood something terrible about himself. He saw Gregory, the commercial manager who walked straight past him on Friday, talking to other managers, all clearly shaken. But those who caught Arthur's attention most were Robert and Penelope. His son was paralyzed in his seat in the first row, staring fixedly at the floor, his hands tightly interlaced. Penelope, beside him, had an expression Arthur couldn't completely decipher. Was it shock? Was it shame? Was it anger? Perhaps all of them together. Mrs. Lorraine approached Arthur with hesitant steps. She still had tears in her eyes, but now there was also a timid smile on her lips. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say. I never expected anything in return for what I did. It was just the right thing to do." Arthur held her hands again. "I know, Mrs. Lorraine, and that is exactly why you deserve this recognition. Because you acted out of pure kindness, without calculating, without expecting. That is rare. That is valuable. And that is what I want to cultivate in this company." David also approached, still processing everything. "We just did what anyone should do," he said modestly. Arthur shook his head. "But it's not what everyone does, David, and that needs to change." After a few minutes, the auditorium was almost empty. Only a few people remained, talking in small groups. Robert finally stood up and walked toward his father. Penelope stayed where she was, watching from a distance. "Dad," Robert began, his voice heavy with contained emotion, "I need to talk to you." Arthur gestured for his son to follow him to his office. They went up in silence in the elevator. The atmosphere was heavy and tense. When they entered the office and closed the door, Robert exploded. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me go through that without knowing? I walked right past you, Dad. I walked past my own father and didn't even notice. How do you think I feel now?" Arthur sat in the chair behind the desk and signaled for Robert to do the same. But his son preferred to stay standing, nervous and agitated. "That was exactly what I needed to see, Robert," Arthur said calmly. "I needed to know how you act when you think no one important is watching. I needed to understand if the values I tried to teach you still mean anything." Robert ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "But I'm not like that. I don't treat people badly." "No," Arthur questioned. "You walked straight past someone who seemed to need help. You didn't change your path. You didn't offer a look, nothing. And do you know why? Because you were too busy discussing numbers, cost cuts, financial strategies. Because that person had no value in your eyes." The words hit Robert like a punch. He finally sat down, dejected. "Have I become that?" he asked in a low voice, more to himself than to his father. "You became what this corporate environment teaches people to be," Arthur replied. "Focused on results, indifferent to the suffering of others, measuring value by position and appearance. But you still have time to change. You're still young. You can still choose what kind of man you want to be." Robert was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "And Mom? She also walked straight past you." Arthur sighed. Your mother and I need to have a difficult conversation, but that is between the two of us. Later that night at home, that conversation finally happened. Penelope was in the living room, sitting on the sofa, a glass of wine in her hand. Arthur entered and sat in the armchair opposite her. The silence between them was loaded with years of distancing, of unspoken conversations, of repressed feelings. You embarrassed me today, Penelope said, breaking the silence. In front of all those employees. Arthur looked at her with a mixture of sadness and determination. I didn't embarrass you, Penelope. You did that to yourself when you chose to look away from someone who seemed to need help. He was a beggar, Arthur, she responded, raising her voice. What did you expect me to do? Stop to talk, give money? I'm afraid of approaching people like that on the street. That wasn't on the street, Arthur said calmly. It was at the entrance of our company, and you didn't even look. Not for a second did you consider that there was a human being there. Penelope took a sip of wine, trying to control her emotions. You're being unfair. You're judging me for something that 90% of people would do. And that is exactly the problem, Arthur replied. We are normalizing coldness. We are accepting the lack of empathy as something natural. And I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to have a company like this anymore. And honestly, Penelope, I don't want to have a marriage like this anymore. The silence that followed was absolute. Penelope put the glass on the table and looked at her husband with wide eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying that for a long time our marriage has been just an appearance, Arthur said. We live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, but we don't share anything real anymore. You care about status, about appearances, about what others will think, but you don't care about what really matters. Penelope felt tears threatening to fall, but she fought them. And you think you're better than me? You who spent 20 years focused on the company, working late, traveling, barely seeing the children grow up. Arthur nodded. You're right. I also made mistakes. I also lost my way. But at least now I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to be better. And I want to know if you are willing to do the same. Penelope was silent, processing. Finally, she said, I don't know if I can change as much as you want. I don't know if I can be this person you're trying to become. Then perhaps, Arthur said in a soft but firm voice, we need to rethink what this marriage is because I don't want to live on appearances anymore. The conversation ended without a definitive resolution, but something had changed. A truth had been spoken. A line had been crossed. In the following days, the company underwent visible transformations. Arthur hired consultants specialized in human development. He implemented weekly workshops on empathy, nonviolent communication, and respect in the workplace. He created anonymous channels so that employees could report situations of disrespect without fear of retaliation. Mrs. Lorraine assumed her new role with dignity and wisdom. She began by visiting each sector, talking to people, listening to stories, and identifying problems. She discovered cases of workplace bullying that had been ignored for months. She discovered employees facing serious personal difficulties who had no one to talk to. She discovered young talents who were constantly undervalued by insecure managers. David became a mentor to new interns, sharing his own story of overcoming and encouraging young people to believe in their abilities. He created a sponsorship program where more experienced employees helped newcomers adapt, not just technically, but emotionally. Some employees resigned, unable to handle the shame of what had happened. Ashley and Brianna were two of them. They handed in their resignation letters on Wednesday, claiming they could no longer work there. Arthur received them personally, talked to them, and tried to show that the goal was not to punish but to transform. But they were determined. Before leaving, however, they apologized. Sincere apologies, loaded with genuine regret. Samuel, the guard, stopped by Arthur's office one morning. He asked for a few minutes. He sat in the chair in front of the desk and with a choked voice apologized. Mr. Sterling, I am ashamed of what I did. You always treated me well, always respected me, and at the first opportunity I had to show who I am, I failed. I failed badly. Arthur looked at him with compassion. Samuel, you are not defined by that moment. You are defined by what you choose to do from now on, and from what I see, you are choosing to be better. Samuel nodded, tears running freely now. I want to be better. I want my children to be proud of me. I want to look in the mirror and like the man I see." "And you will," Arthur said, "because recognizing the error is the first step." Robert also changed. Gradually, he began to get involved in the new human development programs. He started talking more to the employees, asking how they were, and truly listening. He still had a lot to learn, but he was trying. Julia visited the company for the first time after the revelation. She hugged her father and said she was proud of him. She talked at length with Mrs. Lorraine, fascinated by the story of that strong and resilient woman. She said she wanted to write an article about all of it for university, about how small gestures reveal great characters. The transformation was not easy or fast, but it was real. It was deep, and Arthur knew that finally he was on the right path. The path of building not just a successful company, but a place where humanity and profit could coexist, where people were seen as people, not as numbers or resources. And it all started when he decided to become invisible, to discover who really knew how to see. 6 months had passed since that Monday that changed everything. Chicago continued to be the same busy, chaotic city, full of contrasts. But inside the Sterling & Associates building, something fundamental had been transformed. It wasn't visible in the numbers, although those had also improved. It wasn't in the spreadsheets or quarterly reports. The transformation was in the people, in the looks, in the conversations, in the atmosphere breathed in every hallway. Arthur arrived early that Friday morning, as he did every day. But now there was a difference. He didn't go straight to the executive elevator. He walked through the lobby, talking to whomever he met. He greeted Samuel by name, asked about his children, and truly listened to the answers. He stopped to talk to the cleaning team preparing the building for another day. He knew every name, every story, every dream. Samuel had changed visibly. He was no longer just the guard who controlled entries and exits. He had become a guardian in the deepest sense of the word, a guardian of the culture of respect being built. He himself created a personal initiative. Every morning he offered coffee and a smile to anyone who passed through the front door, regardless of who they were. He said it was his way of making up for what he had done on that terrible day. Mrs. Lorraine was in her new office on the 8th floor. It was a simple but dignified room with a desk, comfortable chairs for receiving employees, and many photos on the walls. Photos of her children, of the granddaughters who were starting to arrive, and a special photo Arthur had framed. The image of the employee break room where it all began. She kept that space as a symbol that true transformations start in the simplest places. As coordinator of human relations, Lorraine had become the heart of the company. Employees sought her out to vent about personal problems, ask for advice, and seek support in difficult moments. She never judged, never belittled. She just listened with that wisdom that only life teaches. She created support groups for single mothers, for parents facing difficulties with children, for young people struggling with anxiety. The company was no longer just a place of work. It had become a community. David thrived in his new role. As coordinator of talent development, he identified young people with potential and created real opportunities for growth. But what marked him most was his story. He shared it without shame, without fear. He told of the difficult days of unemployment, of the feeling of invisibility. And this vulnerability created deep connections. Interns and junior employees saw in him proof that it was possible to overcome, grow, and win without losing humanity in the process. Robert had also changed, although the transformation in him was slower and more painful. In the first months after the revelation, he struggled with himself. He questioned his values, his goals, his way of seeing the world. There were days when he wanted to give up, go work at another company and start over somewhere else. But Arthur talked to him patiently, without pressure. Father and son began to have lunch together every Wednesday. They didn't just talk about work, they talked about life, fears, and forgotten dreams. Arthur told stories of his own youth that Robert had never heard. Stories of struggle, of difficulties, of moments when he almost gave up. Robert began to see his father not just as the successful businessman, but as the man behind that impeccable suit. Gradually, Robert began to apply what he learned. He started leading his team differently, less authoritarian, more human. He asked about people's personal lives, offered flexibility when someone faced problems, and celebrated small victories. He discovered that results don't come just from pressure, but from trust, mutual respect, and an environment where people feel valued. Julia became a volunteer at the company, even while still a psychology student. Twice a week after classes, she went there to facilitate conversation circles about mental health at work. The employees opened up to her in a surprising way. They talked about burnout, about anxiety, about the constant pressure for results. And Julia, with her natural sensitivity, helped them find healthier paths. She was particularly proud of her father. One night during a family dinner, she said to him, "Dad, you did something few leaders have the courage to do. You admitted you were wrong. You recognized you needed to change, and you really changed. That is rare. That is valuable." Arthur and Penelope, on the other hand, followed different paths. The conversation that night months ago had been just the beginning of many other difficult conversations. They tried to reconnect, tried to find what once united them. But the truth was painful. They had become very different people with incompatible values. They decided by mutual agreement to separate. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. Penelope moved to an apartment in Lincoln Park. They maintained a cordial relationship, especially for the sake of the children. She started working as an image consultant, an area that always fascinated her. And although she hadn't changed as much as Arthur hoped, at least she was being authentic with herself. Arthur, for his part, discovered a lightness he hadn't felt in years. Living alone in the Gold Coast apartment brought him unexpected peace. He had time to reflect, to read, to simply be. He started attending a meditation group. He went back to playing the guitar, a hobby abandoned for decades. He reconnected with himself. But the greatest transformation was indeed in the company. The numbers proved what Arthur had always believed. Humanity and profit are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, with happier, more valued, and more engaged employees, productivity increased. Turnover dropped drastically. The company began to attract the best talents in the market, not for the salaries, which were competitive but not the highest, but for the culture, the environment, and the way people were treated. Other companies began to seek out Arthur to understand what had happened. How was such a deep transformation possible in so little time? He always answered the same way. "It started when I stopped looking at people as resources and started seeing them as human beings. When I understood that character cannot be bought or demanded, character is cultivated, inspired, and built day after day." Sterling and Associates became a reference not just in results, but in humanized management. Universities wanted to study the case. Business magazines published articles. But Arthur always made a point of clarifying. The merit wasn't his. It was Mrs. Lorraine's, who taught that kindness doesn't need an audience. It was David's, who proved that empathy is stronger than indifference. It was every employee's who chose to change, grow, and be better. On that Friday morning, 6 months later, Arthur called another general meeting. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. People arrived curious and excited. There was no tension, there was positive expectation. When everyone was gathered, Arthur took the stage. He looked at that sea of faces and felt deep emotion. He recognized each one. He knew names, stories, and dreams. 6 months ago, he began, I conducted a test. I wanted to find out if this company still had a soul, or if it had become just a cold machine. What I discovered saddened me deeply, but it also gave me hope, because I discovered that even in the midst of coldness, goodness still existed. He pointed to Mrs. Lorraine and David, who were sitting in the second row. These two people taught me something fundamental, that the true value of someone is not in the title they hold, the money they earn, or the clothes they wear. It is in how they treat others when no one is watching. Arthur paused. Today, 6 months later, I see a transformed company. I see people who truly greet each other, who ask how the other is and really want to know the answer. I see leaders who inspire instead of just ordering. I see a community. He looked at Robert, who was among the managers. I see my son becoming the man I always knew he could be, a leader who leads with his heart, not just his head. Robert smiled, his eyes shining. Arthur continued, but the transformation cannot stop here. It must continue, every day, in every interaction, in every decision, because building a culture of respect and empathy is not a project with an end date. It is a daily commitment. he concluded. "I want to thank each of you who chose to change, who chose to be better, who chose to see the human in every person who crosses your path. You proved that it is possible to succeed without losing your soul. And that, my friends, is the greatest achievement of all." The room exploded in applause, but it wasn't polite, formal applause. It was genuine, warm, and loaded with emotion. Mrs. Lorraine was crying. David was smiling broadly. Samuel, at the back of the room, discreetly wiped his eyes. Robert stood up and began to give a standing ovation. Soon everyone did the same. When the auditorium finally emptied, Arthur stayed alone on stage for a few minutes. He looked around, absorbing the silence. He thought about everything that had happened. The radical decision to disguise himself, the pain of being invisible, the joy of finding goodness where he least expected it, the courage to confront the truth and the hard work of transforming. He took his phone and opened the photos. He had a photo from that day 6 months ago. Someone had photographed him when he was sitting on the bench in front of the building, dressed as a beggar, invisible to everyone. He looked at that image and felt gratitude. Gratitude for having had the courage to see the truth. Gratitude for the people who taught him that humanity still exists. He left the auditorium and went down to the front desk. Samuel was there, as always. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. Have a great weekend." Arthur smiled. "You too, Samuel, and thank you for everything." Samuel nodded, moved. "I'm the one who thanks you, sir, for giving me a second chance to show who I really am." Arthur walked to the street. The sun was shining brightly that Chicago morning. He watched the people passing by hurriedly, each in their own world. How many of them were invisible? How many needed just a look, a gesture, a chance? He decided to walk to the subway instead of taking the car. On the way, he saw a man sitting on the sidewalk, holding out his hand. Arthur stopped. He looked into his eyes. "Good morning," he said with respect. "Can I help you with anything?" The man looked up, surprised. It had been a long time since someone greeted him with dignity. Arthur talked to him for a few minutes and discovered his name was Charles and that he had lost his job 6 months ago. He gave him money, but more importantly, he gave him the company card and told him to look for Mrs. Lorraine, that perhaps there was an opportunity. Charles held the card with trembling hands, his eyes full of tears. "Thank you, sir. You don't know what this means." Arthur smiled. "I do. I know exactly what it means to be seen when everyone ignores you." He kept walking, his heart full. The journey had no end. There would always be more to do, more to change, more to learn. But at least now he was on the right path. The path where people matter more than numbers, where character is worth more than status, where goodness doesn't need an audience. And it all started when he decided to be invisible, to discover who really knew how to see. In the process, he discovered that many didn't see. But he also discovered that some, the most valuable ones, always saw. And those were the ones who deserved to be celebrated, promoted, and honored. Arthur Sterling, the businessman who had everything, discovered that the greatest wealth was not in bank accounts. It was in the looks that recognize humanity, in the gestures that offer dignity, in the words that restore hope. And mainly, it was in the courage to change when one realizes the path is wrong. 6 months ago, he was a successful but restless man. Today, he was a man at peace, because he had finally built something worth having, not just a profitable company, but a place where people could be fully human. And that, he discovered, was priceless. Dear listeners, we hope that Arthur Sterling's story has touched your heart deeply. If you were moved by the journey of this man who had the courage to see the truth, leave your like right now. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story like this one. And in the comments, tell us which moment marked you the most. Was it the coldness Arthur faced, Mrs. Lorraine's kindness, Robert's transformation, or the final lesson about seeing the human in every person? Every day we bring intense and moving narratives that reveal the deepest side of the human.